Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. Now, war criminals in history are mostly men, but not always. One of the most notorious women was the Bitch of Buchenwald. The general public ran riot with tales of her barbaric acts, but what was she actually responsible for, and what was she actually tried for? Tomaz Jardim joins us to explain. His book on the subject is in the description below. It's in the links below, or you can find it at your favorite bookstore. I'll bring Thomas in now. How are you today, sir?
I'm very good. Thank you for having me.
So now we're kind of 10, 11 shows into this series there, and it's going better than I thought it would. I didn't think people would be as invested in war crimes because there is this inherent feeling that maybe justice wasn't served quite enough and people got out quite quickly. And I can sense people's frustration with the subject. But given that you educate about the Holocaust, generally World War II, do you have a particular reason why we should still be talking about the war crimes and indeed the perpetrators?
Well, I think trials in general are such a rich source for the historian and also for anybody interested. I mean, I think you can look at trials from all different angles. I mean, for one, of course, you have the perpetrators who are on the stand trying to answer for their crimes. And so we do get sort of an entry point into the psychology of the perpetrators and trying to grapple with this sense of responsibility for unprecedented crimes. I think from the perspective of understanding the crimes themselves, I mean, war crimes trials are an immensely rich source of documentary evidence and testimony about these crimes. I mean, the very number 6 million, for instance, with regards to the Holocaust, first emerges out of the Nuremberg trials and the processing of the thousands and thousands of pages of documents necessary to indict and then prosecute those perpetrators at Nuremberg. So I think from a historical point, they're immensely important. And I also think they have an immense contemporary relevance. I mean, yes, we're living in a time in which the bounds of international law, I think at this point, I mean, I don't even know if I'd use the word stretched anymore. They're being broken all over the place. And I think looking back to war crimes trials, I think is a way for us to sort of contemplate how, after such a catastrophic conflict with the Second World War, one group of people or one generation of people sought to reckon with how we contend with those crimes, what the value of international law is, what the value is of criminalizing acts of state and acts of aggression and acts against civilian populations. And I think that's a question that's very much alive and with us. And I would also say I've focused, both of the books that I've written contend significantly with American military trials. And part of my interest in those trials in particular is because I think when we think of post-war justice for war crimes trials, particularly with the United States involved, we think of the international military tribunals at Nuremberg, where we have these lofty legal principles, a small number of defendants. And few people know that, in fact, at the very same time that the Nuremberg trials were occurring, we have these military tribunals set up by the United States at Dachau, on the grounds of the former concentration camp Dachau, where they're just funneling through hundreds of perpetrators at a time in the interest of expediency and according to a wholly different body of law. And so I think I also have sought in my own work to try and redress this kind of imbalance of understanding about what American post-war justice looked like, to the extent that I think when all the controversy and justifiable controversy and outrage about Guantanamo Bay and the tribunals there emerged, so many editorials sort of said, this is a great betrayal of our ideals as we came out of the Second World War and established the Nuremberg trials. And my own point is, actually, it's a terrible thing, but it's not as great a deviation from the American pattern as one often thinks if we reintegrate understanding of the Dachau trials and these military trials into our understanding of what happened after the Second World War, when we have a lot of war criminals dealt with in quite a summary fashion.
Brilliant. Well, that's a great introduction there. And we'll bring up your slides. And folks, what we're going to do today is we'll do the questions at the end today, although I think the questions detail will probably be covered by Thomas as we go along. But I'm going to hand over to my guest to take us through this. And if there are questions, of course, we'll deal with them. So over to you, sir. And obviously a bit of sort of parental guidance. There will be some sort of pretty savage descriptions of things in this presentation because it's the nature of the beast, quite literally. Yeah, be prepared for for the details. So over to you, sir.
Okay, well, very good. So here you can see, this is just the cover of my book, but I think we could use this. This is a guide to what I'll be talking about too. Ilse Koch on trial and making the bitch of Buchenwald, the idea that this is a bit of a creation. So indeed, in talking about Ilse Koch, I will be talking about this woman infamously dubbed the bitch of Buchenwald for concentration camp crimes she was alleged to have committed while her husband Karl was commandant of the camp. And I think it's just worth noting how deeply ironic I think it is that it would be Ilse and not Karl, who was commandant of Buchenwald, later Majdanek, previously Sachsenhausen. Yet it's Ilse, not Karl, who would emerge at the end of the Second World War as one of the most widely reviled, symbols of Nazi barbarism, despite the fact that she never occupied an official position in the Nazi state. But nonetheless, there are widely reported claims that she had collected lampshades made from the skin of murdered concentration camp inmates. And these reports, I think, really sunk deeply into the post-war consciousness. They inspired, they had reverberations in culture and politics. They provide everything from, a folk song by Woody Guthrie, the Boer Cost Name, a poem by Sylvia Plath, right through to this pornographic cult film, Ilse, She-Wolf of the SS. But the fact that there was actually little evidence to tie Koch to this alleged atrocity of creating lampshades from prisoners' skin, the fact that there's little evidence for this really did little, I think, to dampen popular fascination with her case, even despite the fact that attempts to prosecute her for this crime actually twice failed in court. So really what I would like to do now is to show that really to understand Ilse Koch's quite prominent place in the post-war imagination, and also to account for the sort of fervor with which her case was pursued, we have to interrogate how gender norms and expectations shaped perceptions of Koch's exercise of violence and perceptions of her moral and of her criminal culpability. Because as we'll see, both in the press and in the courts, the egregious, horrific crimes attributed to Koch were presented sort of as the product of a deviant femininity and of warped sexual impulses that placed her allegedly, outside the community of quote unquote ordinary women. So in a way, if male violence in the concentration camps was rationalized as perhaps natural and stemming somehow from the obligations imposed on duty-bound men by the state, Koch was judged guilty in part because she was accused of having acted autonomously to commit atrocities, allegedly again in the service of quote-unquote unwomanly impulses. So in telling Koch's story now, I'd like to explore these gender perception and the express sexualization of Koch's crimes in order just to try and make sense of her zealous prosecution, really at a time when male Nazi perpetrators, who are often responsible for far greater crimes, often escaped prosecution or received comparatively light sentences. Now, Ilse Koch actually stood not once, not once, not twice. There are 3 trials. Of course, I don't have time today to explore each of these proceedings in any depth. But again, I would like to examine the way Koch's crimes were depicted, how they were adjudicated, and how the public sort of perceived and responded to Koch's alleged atrocities over the course of what was ultimately a very long legal odyssey. Because really what I want you to take away here, I think, is that the widespread fascination with Koch made her alleged crimes quite formative, I think, in shaping post-war perceptions of Nazism in the post-war period. But what I want to illustrate, however, is that this disproportionate interest in Koch's crimes really functioned more to obscure than to elucidate the nature of Nazi criminality. And I would argue, again, to hinder rather than to promote popular comprehension of the Holocaust. So This story really begins with the liberation of Buchenwald on the 11th of April, 1945. It's important for me to mention right out of the gate that Ilse and Karl Koch had not been present at the camp for nearly 2 years, that is since August of 1943, when the couple had been arrested by the SS following an investigation into corruption at the camp during Karl's tenure as commandant. Now, I don't have time to discuss the details of that, I think, quite remarkable and curious story, but the bottom line was that the end result was the SS court found Karl guilty of graft and, believe it or not, of the unauthorized killing of concentration camp inmates and sentenced him to death, while Ilse, who in this case had been charged only with the possession of stolen goods, was acquitted for lack of evidence. But even though Karl and Ilse were long gone when American soldiers first entered the camp in 1945, the scenes of, we've seen this depicted so many times, but just unimaginable atrocity they encountered provided, of course, overwhelming evidence of the murderous nature of the camp that Karl had established back in 1937 and then run for 6 years. And in total, about 56,000 people died there. Now, alongside these soldiers, these liberating forces who arrived at the camp on the 11th of April, a small team of war crimes investigators also arrived, tasked with gathering material evidence, with gathering the statements from survivors in the hopes that this would facilitate the future prosecution of those responsible for such horrific crimes. And key to the story that I'm going to tell you now was a shocking discovery that they made of preserved human remains in the camp's pathology department. And as you can see in the next slide here, with the help of liberated prisoners, and you can see some in the background, investigators assembled a display table of what they found in the pathology department. And again, take a look at the slide. We see 2 shrunken heads. We see preserved human organs, segments of dried, tattooed skins, and a lampshade on the right there, seemingly fashioned from human skin. And this display was sort of set up to try and drive home Buchenwald's horrors to the throngs of journalists who flooded the camp at liberation. And it really created a great deal of shock and outrage as images of this display table, were published galore in the press and made the round on newsreels and all of this kind of stuff. But it's in connection to these objects that Ilse Koch's name first begins to appear in the reports of U.S. war crimes investigators, and at the same time also in the international press. And so again, even though Ilse Koch had not been present at Buchenwald for nearly 2 years before the discovery of these objects, rumors of her involvement spread fast. And as we know, they ultimately stuck. The U.S. Army, for instance, filmed numerous newsreels, again, including the table. They also filmed a former inmate recounting how, and I'll quote him directly, this is the survivor speaking in this newsreel. He says, "Karl Koch had a table lamp, which was made from tattooed human skin. I couldn't recognize the material of the lampshade from the distance I saw it, but it was said that it belonged to Frau Koch." Now, this rather vague description was then included in a widely circulated newsreel by the U.S. Army under the very unambiguous title, Ilse Koch's lampshade. And then the first U.S. Army reports on war crimes at Buchenwald elaborated on the alleged connection between Ilse Koch and these what they called extraordinary objects that she had allegedly had prisoners killed in order to fabricate. Now, the reports also drew upon rumors among camp inmates concerning allegations of Koch's sexual deviance. So according to this first major U.S. Army report on crimes at Buchenwald, to quote again, "Both Karl Koch and his wife were perverts, the husband a homosexual, the wife a nymphomaniac. Both satisfied their desires on the hapless inmates. The wife would walk through the camp, pick a likely partner, take him for the night, and then invariably have him shot," end quote. So as accounts of this sort, of human skin lampshades, of the alleged sexual perversity of the woman who was said to have commissioned them, found distribution in the press, Ilse's name actually quite quickly became synonymous with the atrocities committed at Buchenwald, again, despite the fact that she has no official position there. The press came to refer to her as the bitch of Buchenwald. They reported at length, again, on salacious rumors of her sex life. They referred to her as times, some quotes here, as a nymphomaniac, as a seductress of unquenchable sexual appetite, who, a few papers even reported, bathed at night in Madeira wine. But what was Koch's actual role at Buchenwald? And the reality is that this remains somewhat murky, partly because she had no official position in the camp, and partly because what we do know about her comes from post-war testimonies, often based on what witnesses called, quote unquote, common knowledge in the camp, essentially rumor and hearsay passed from one inmate to another. What we do know for sure is that Koch was either pregnant or raising young children throughout the period Karl was commandant. She, in fact, gave birth in 1938, in 1939, and in 1940, and was then quite preoccupied with parenting. Now, these pictures that I have on the screen here, this is from one of their family albums that you can find in the American National Archives in Washington. You get the sense of this beautiful domestic scene. But I should underscore here that being confined considerably to the domestic sphere did not insulate Koch from participating in Buchenwald's criminality. She not only benefited from her husband's corruption, with furs and nice cars and furniture and things like this, but she did use inmate slave labor, both in her garden and for domestic help, people whom she appears to have treated with contempt and sometimes violence. But again, Koch's connection to human skin lampshades, however, was anything but clear. Now, American investigators had gathered testimony from survivors who had heard that Koch had possessed such items, but these statements were actually contradicted by a number of well-placed former inmates who had actually worked as prisoner functionaries in the pathology department where the skins were found. And they traced responsibility for this horrifying practice not to Ilse, but in fact to an SS doctor named Erich Wagner. It was he, they alleged, who had searched the camp morgue for tattooed corpses to have the skins, as one survivor said, peeled off and tanned. Now, why would he do this? Apparently, this was part of Wagner's doctoral research into a totally absurd connection he was seeking to draw between the practice of tattooing one's skin and habitual criminality. I actually looked it up, and his dissertation was accepted by the University of Jena. Now, tattooed skins aside, Koch's name does indeed make numerous appearances in the testimony that investigators gathered, even if the witnesses themselves had never personally encountered her. Various survivors reported on her activities at the camp and how, likely as a result of the rumors that swirled around her, her presence really inspired terror. And I just want to kind of pause to reflect on this point for a second, because for many, it seemed, Koch was one of the most feared figures at the camp. And why was this? Because I think this is quite curious. As we know, inmates at Buchenwald were subjected to violence and the threat of death really on a daily basis at the hands of the SS. So why would Ilse Koch factor so prominently in the testimonies of survivors and be such a potent source of anxiety, especially given the fact that so few survivors claim to have actually encountered her themselves? This probably has to do, at least in part, with the fact simply that Koch was one of the only women that any inmate might have the chance of glimpsing over the course of their incarceration. So her memory really stuck out in their mind. Given her alleged good looks, her status as the commandant's wife, which was apparently widely known, her rare appearances really do seem to have made deep impressions. They inspired fear and a lot of speculation, and transformed her, even while the camp was still in existence, into a nearly mythical figure among the inmates. And I think there's something about the fact that she was a woman outside the SS structures of power that people found to be particularly maybe unpredictable, a particularly frightening source of authority.
Yeah, just to interrupt, was that sense of, you say, when I was in Auschwitz last November, the routine becomes everything. Routine, organization, certain times of day, length of, and everyone's almost sort of switched off because of hunger and everything else. If you're an inmate or everything except routine, but someone who is floating through the environment in an unpredictable way, and they're also not physically like the other people you're encountering, of course, that's going to just become the person you're going to remember. And then, of course, with people being moved all the time and disappearing, rumor builds on rumor, and I can see how it starts.
Yeah, and a rumor, of course, under these circumstances, is a mode of survival, right? There's no newspaper in the camp. People have to figure out, who are these people? Who do we worry about? What has that guy done? And people certainly asked questions about her. It's actually interesting to note, she'd been gone from the camp since August of 1943. You hear about inmates who only arrived at Buchenwald in 1944 who talk about her at length. It was like she still loomed so large in the psyche of the inmate population, even when she wasn't even present anymore. So I think you're exactly right there. So it's worth just pointing out, what was it that inmates actually did see her do at the camp. Some recalled Koch riding around the environs of the camp on horseback. She was forbidden from entering the main camp compound, but she rode around the environs of the camp, sort of as you describe. People see her as they labor. Some felt or believed that she was noting down the numbers of prisoners she felt were not working hard enough. Others claimed that she wore intentionally provocative clothing to taunt prisoners into looking at her, in which point she would either berate them. Some claimed that she would hit them with her riding crop, or similarly jot down their numbers. And then, as Time magazine later put it, those who she singled out in this fashion for punishment were then, again in Time magazine's estimation, quote, flogged for the pleasure it gave her. So these often sexualized accounts of violence she was alleged to have committed, I think, not only fueled a public interest in Koch, but helped spur war crimes investigators to add her to a list of suspects to be arrested for trial, even despite the fact that she had no official position in the camp, and even while details of Koch's activities remained speculative. So how then did Ilse Koch wind up in the dock for war crimes? And how were allegations and speculations contained in the reports of American investigators translated actually into concrete criminal charges? I should just say quickly that because Buchenwald had been liberated by American forces, the United States claimed jurisdiction to prosecute its personnel, even though it ultimately fell within the Soviet zone. And so US prosecutors decided to select an initial group of 31 defendants who were in their custody, who they suspected of committing war crimes at Buchenwald, to stand trial before a military commission court. And Ilse Koch was one. And so Koch was arrested by American occupation authorities, apparently while she was strolling down the road in the city of Ludwigsburg on a summer day. She was apparently recognized on the street by a former camp inmate. And it's quite interesting that, at least according to her own recollection, she says she was absolutely shocked to learn that American authorities would designate her as a war crime suspect. This is to quote Ilse from a little bit later, Ilse Koch from a little bit later. She said, it would have been easy for me to obtain false papers and live somewhere else with a false name, or have to disguise myself. But I had no reason whatsoever to disappear. I never even conceived of the possibility of being put on trial. But put on trial she was. And like the rest of her co-defendants, she was indicted only for a single all-encompassing crime. This was kind of the special tool of the prosecutors that worked at Dachau. This charge, I've written it up here, participating in a common design to commit war crimes. Now, according to this charge, the prosecutor, who you see pictured here, William Denson, didn't need to show that a single defendant had committed a specific act of violence or killing, but only that they had in some way, through their duty, aided and abetted a criminal enterprise. And in this case, the criminal enterprise was the concentration camp Buchenwald. So to prove his case, Chief Prosecutor Denson needed to show only that there was in place at Buchenwald a system to ill-treat and murder prisoners, that each defendant was aware of this system, simply basically by being present, and that each had in some way participating in helping the system to function. So actually, according to this prosecutorial argument, really the camp cook peeling potatoes was as guilty as the hangman. They're all helping to this criminal enterprise to function. Now, the military tribunal that heard Koch's case was situated on the grounds of the former concentration camp Dachau, and its primary goal was efficiency. In fact, I think we could even say expediency.
Yeah.
American military authorities declared lax rules of evidence, allowing the use of testimony. I'm going to quote the pamphlet here, deemed to be of probative value to the reasonable man. It's a pretty elastic definition. So this includes using hearsay. This includes using the statements of witnesses who are not present in court to be cross-examined. And the court itself was not comprised of legal experts. Instead, only one of the 8 judges who would hear the case required formal legal training. The rest merely needed to be senior officers considered to be, to quote the pamphlet again, men of stature in their professions. Conviction doesn't require a consensus. It only requires a majority vote. And those found guilty then have no avenue for appeal. So how do things unfold? Really, as anticipation really builds for this Buchenwald trial, military prosecutors did something odd, I think. They announced to the press through the publication of a pamphlet that they would show, or what they would show each defendant had done. And this pamphlet claimed that the prosecution would show that Ilse Koch had, to quote it, indulged in personal sadism against inmates, had, second, caused the deaths of many hundreds of inmates, and third, had specifically indulged in the sadistic practice of using human skins of inmates for personal items. Now, further fueling interest in Koch's case was the absolutely explosive revelation, given all this interest in her sex life, apparently, this explosive revelation 2 days before proceedings began that somehow she had gotten herself pregnant while in American custody. So when the trial opened on the 11th of April, 1947, 2 years to the day, by the way, following Buchenwald's liberation, of course, all eyes were on Koch, much more than her 30 co-defendants. And as the defendants entered the courtroom for the first time, the press really raced to find adjectives that would somehow sort of combine Koch's alleged evil with her supposed beauty and her sexual perversity. And so we have descriptions that would never be used with regard to her male co-defendants. Many stories began with descriptions of her looks, sometimes even her various body parts. She was referred to in these reports in the press as the bitch of Buchenwald, as the witch of Buchenwald. Stars and Stripes even called her the sex-hungry bitch of Buchenwald. Journalists commented on her, quote, voluptuous body, noting that she was, quote, hard-faced and red-haired or red-headed and quick-witted. But I can't resist just reading a small description from the most extensive report on her trial's opening, which appeared in Newsweek magazine. And this Newsweek article literally juxtaposed in sort of a centerfold photos of Ilse in a bathing suit with photos of emaciated concentration camp inmates alongside the Buchenwald gallows. But the report describes her appearance in court as follows. It says, "She is still attractive despite her rather blousy brown sack suit, her short socks, bare legs, and saddle shoes. Flaming Titian hair, emerald green eyes, and a schoolgirl complexion belie that she is 40. On a prison diet, she has reduced 40 pounds until her figure, despite a too prominent derriere and a still conspicuous bust, is almost boyish. One can read an occasional sullenness in her face, but little to suggest that she is the fiendish character the mounting piles of evidence prove her to be." Now, such salacious descriptions, I think, help to satisfy the growing thirst for details of her trials really back in the United States. And in fact, Koch's trial would be reported on more than that of any other Nazi perpetrator, save for Hitler's leading henchman at the main trial at Nuremberg. So just to give you some sense of what that actually looks like, the New York Times, for instance, just that one paper printed no less than 97 stories on Ilse Koch in the weeks and months following the trial's commencement. Now, because these proceedings were designed for expediency, the prosecution focused first on illustrating the criminal nature of Buchenwald as a whole in order to meet the needs of this common design charge. And of course, this was proven easily. But the evidence used to tie Ilse Koch to that criminal enterprise was thin. So Chief Prosecutor Denson, of course, made full use of the lax rules of evidence permitted in the court. He drew almost entirely upon hearsay to tie Koch to atrocities. Now, there were, I should be careful to point out, a few witnesses that did testify that they themselves had seen Koch either physically assault a prisoner or report a prisoner to the SS. But the most sensational crimes attributed to her, again, were supported only by the conjecture of witnesses or the recitation of camp rumor. Give you a sense of the tone of this, one witness, for instance, stated that while he had no personal knowledge of Koch's killing of prisoners for the skin, it was nonetheless, quote, common knowledge in the camp that this occurred. Another concluded his own testimony about Koch's activities and lampshades and things by clarifying that, quote, "This is only my opinion. I have no proof." Now, for his part, the chief prosecutor, Denson, tried to, and imagine him doing this to a male defendant, he tried to juxtapose Koch's alleged cruelty with her role as wife and mother, calling attention to her alleged promiscuity. So in a thinly veiled reference to what was the still, actually to this day, still murky circumstances of her pregnancy, he asked her on the stand whether she had, quote, maintained the same standard of moral conduct while in American custody as she had maintained while living at Buchenwald, and whether she was indeed, quote, an adoring, loving mother whose interest was in her home. Yet even with the weaknesses in the testimony that he elicited, Denson was satisfied by the trial's end that he had shown Koch to be, to quote him, no woman in the usual sense, but a creature from some other tortured world, who was, quote, a sadistic pervert of monumental proportions unmatched in history. Koch, I think Denson directly implies or even argues, had not only committed serious statutory crime, but he's implying here that she bore a dual guilt for her violation of accepted gender norms and her alleged failings as a mother and wife. Now, I think one reason Denson could be confident that the court would convict Koch, and in fact the entire roster of Buchenwald defendants, was that this wasn't his first rodeo. He had in fact tried dozens of other perpetrators in the Dachau courts from the actual camp Dachau and also from Mauthausen, and he had achieved a 100% rate of conviction, sort of the common story in these tribunals. And so this time, just as before, the military judges did not disappoint, After only hours of deliberation, the court found Koch and all of her co-defendants guilty and sentenced more than 20 of them to death. And even though the judges provided no explanation for their verdicts, Koch escaped the hangman's noose, certainly, or I shouldn't say certainly, in all likelihood, because of her pregnancy. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it seems that getting pregnant in custody may even have been a conscious survival strategy on her part. But because of her pregnancy, she was instead sentenced to life imprisonment. Now, as it turned out, Koch's story with American authorities is not over yet, because when her sentence then underwent the mandatory review by superior military judicial authorities, those authorities who read over the findings of the court immediately recognized that evidence for Koch's actual violent crime was exceedingly thin. Now, the people reviewing Koch's trial were not like the judges on the court who had no legal training. These were serious military and civilian lawyers, people with real expertise. And they were charged with writing reports, reviewing the case, because there is no avenue to appeal, so they do these official reviews. And those reviews wind up on this guy's desk. That is, on the slide, General Lucius Clay, who was the American military governor of occupied Germany. It falls to Clay to sign off on all of the Dachau sentences before they can be carried out. So he gets all these reports and he puts a signature to them, and people are hung accordingly or have their sentences reduced, etc. So there's a number of judicial reviews before sentences are signed off on that have to be handed over to Clay. So what do these judicial reviewers conclude when they actually read over the case that has been tried at Dachau? Koch's case was officially reviewed first by two attorneys from the office of something called the Deputy Judge Advocate for War Crimes. They concluded as follows, after reviewing the whole trial record. They said, quote, "In spite of the extravagant statements made in the newspapers, the record contains little convincing evidence against the accused. In regard to the widely publicized charges that she had ordered inmates killed for their tattooed skin, the record is especially silent." They found key testimonies against Koch to be, quote, "based on presumption and of doubtful veracity." Though Koch was shown to have beaten several inmates, they concluded, quote, "no deaths or serious injuries are shown to have resulted." Now, next, the other official review that had to be conducted was by a parallel advisory board called the War Crimes Review Board, which was staffed of military and civilian lawyers. They conduct their own independent review. This War Crimes Review Board similarly concluded that there was no reliable evidence that Koch had had prisoners killed. And to quote it directly, "nor is there any evidence in this record of any kind that she at any time," they really want to underscore this here, "ever ordered any article made of human skin." So finally, these reports are sent off to the judge advocate of the US Army in Europe. This is the highest ranking jurist in Germany. This is Colonel Harbaugh. He has to pull all this stuff together, read the reviews of his subordinates, read the record, and make a final recommendation to Clay. He does all this, and what does he conclude after reading all of this? I think he notes quite perceptively the following. He says, "I can't see anything on which we can honestly hold the accused. There is no question but that she was tried in the newspapers and suffered both before and during her trial from her unique position as the only woman at the camp." Harbaugh then concluded by labeling her sentence, excessive, and recommended that Clay reduce her sentence from life to 4 years. And this is a recommendation that Clay readily accepted. So the end result of this is that within a few short months, Ilse Koch went from the prospect of facing a life behind bars to anticipating release from American custody in a few short years with credit for time served. So how then does the very eager and voracious press and public respond to the announcement of Koch's dramatic sentence reduction back in the United States. Surprise, surprise, with absolute shock and outrage. Editorial pages across the country ask whether the United States Army basically had lost its nerve, had lost its capacity for sound judgment. Of course, all of these articles continue to uncritically assert that Koch was a sexual deviant who had killed prisoners for their skins. To quote a few here, the editors of the Miami Herald demanded to know, quote, "In the name of basic human justice and decency, what further does the army need to slap Ilse into jail and keep her there?" The New York Post went so far to label the reduction of Koch's sentence General Clay's counter-atrocity and described it as, quote, "almost beyond credence." And then Ed Sullivan, who was at that point writing for the New York News, pondered cynically whether, quote, "the army reduced Koch's sentence so she could get back into the lampshade business." So these statements, I think, really reveal that for many, the caricature of Koch as the sort of perverse, mass-murdering beast of Buchenwald was sort of impervious to the evidence-based reality that emerged both from her trial and especially from its review. You know, few questioned the monstrous image of Koch that I think positioned her as a popular lightning rod for the condemnation of Nazi crimes, and an easy one. Now, not surprisingly, this outrage in the media soon found its parallel in the public sphere and literally on the streets of American cities. There was a letter campaign, for instance, that was started, which asked concerned citizens to write directly to President Truman and demand that her reduction be reduced. Rallies were organized by veterans associations, by the American World Jewish Congress. And in fact, when General Clay visited the United States in the midst of this controversy, events organized to honor him were actually picketed. Protesters, as you can see, carry these placards. Some even carried lampshades. They demand his removal from power. At this point, even Woody Guthrie, sort of the pioneer of the protest song, chimed in. He wrote a ballad called Ilse Koch, which of course railed against her release and talks about the skins and the lampshades and all that kind of stuff. So we have pressure from the press, then pressure on the street. And what ultimately happens is that this reaches government. Ultimately, a group of Republican senators decide that they are going to launch an investigation into this sentence reduction, and they actually hold hearings in the US Senate, which were clearly intended, at least in part, to try and embarrass the Democratic administration of Harry Truman as being sort of soft on Nazis and this kind of stuff. Now, I don't have time to detail those hearings, but suffice it to say they were as much, I think, a political as a judicial exercise. These hearings, they pulled up some of the same people for trial, some of the same key witnesses, some of those who had written these reviews, even the trial judge. What do we learn? Well, I think the most telling testimony that comes out in the US Senate came from Buchenwald's, or the trial's chief prosecutor, William Denson, who now does this remarkable about face, claiming now that he never felt evidence tying Koch to human lampshades was ever very strong or necessary to her case. So he says the following. He says, "Let me say this in all sincerity. I did not feel that the skin business, because of the tenuousness of the proof, was of such importance. The gravamen of her action was in beating prisoners and causing them to be beat." Yet Denson, despite this, continues to insist that Koch remained unambiguously guilty and absolutely deserving of her life sentence. Why? Well, he argued, and here we get gender again, he argued that unlike Koch's male co-defendants, who had official rank at Buchenwald, she, as a woman, he explicitly states, quote, had no reason in the world for exercising the authority she exercised. She was more capable because this was gratuitous. So even though the final Senate report that culminated from these hearings acknowledged that the sensational charges for which Koch was known, concerning tattooed human skins, for instance, went unproven. What happens now is that lesser crimes of violence were nonetheless judged as egregious because they exposed what Koch's, in this case, court-ordered psychiatric assessment termed a, quote, level of cruelty alien to female nature. So what do these senators conclude and recommend? They take their cue from Denson, and they conclude that, quote, in being a woman and in acting independently, Koch's violence had been, quote, more unnatural and more deliberate. Like much of the American public, the senators remained convinced that her original life sentence was justified, and they concluded their report with a recommendation that she be retried. Now, not by the U.S. Army, because this would constitute a double jeopardy, but instead they hatch a plan to have this done by the newly independent West German judiciary. So in the end, Koch was indeed retried by a West German court, not for acts of violence she herself committed, and not because she requested the killing of inmates for their skins, but for the comparatively lesser crimes of, quote, incitement to murder and incitement to bodily harm. Koch, as you can see in this picture here, she's only briefly smiling, I would think. She was arrested by West German authorities the moment she walked out of Landsberg prison after serving out her U.S. sentence. Her West German trial would again result in another life sentence, this time for having instigated, as I said, beatings carried out by Buchenwald's SS guards. Now, I don't have time to detail this West German trial, but I do just want to quickly underscore, again, the degree to which gendered perceptions of violence and culpability, again, informed the judgment of the court and the harsh punishment that Koch received. So, as a woman, the judges expressly argued, Koch allegedly, the judges argue, had a moral duty to act with caring and compassion, a duty, they implied, that was not expected of men. So in their written judgment, the Augsburg court judges declared the following. They said that the conditions reigning in Buchenwald should have evoked in her, being a woman, compassion and pity, emotions that should be obvious for every woman. While other SS wives, the judges argued, somehow, quote, had done good to the extent that it was possible in light of their weaker power, only Miss Koch refused a human emotion of this kind. So Koch was then, the judges concluded, a ruthless, hard-headed woman, devoid of all feminine feeling, who basically observed the violence of the camp SS with what they termed inner satisfaction, and was therefore deserving of this new life sentence that she received. So Koch would then spend the next 16 years in Eichach Women's Penitentiary, repeatedly petitioning Bavarian authorities for clemency unsuccessfully. At the same time, her mental health begins to deteriorate rapidly. It was already showing signs of deterioration during her trial. This leads to periods of delusions, periods of institutionalization, and an eventual diagnosis of so-called confinement psychosis. And you can really see this in the poems and in the letters that Koch wrote to her children, some of which were kindly provided to me by her daughter Gisela, in which her views become more extreme, more unhinged. And so over time, she begins to express a paranoid anti-Semitism to account for her incarceration. She casts herself sort of as the innocent victim of a cabal of vengeful Jews. She fantasizes about revenge in these poems and letters. She dreams about divine intervention from God. And with each rejection of her annual petitions for clemency, it seems her mental health deteriorated further. She actually became convinced, for instance, that the guards at night were letting vengeful Jews into her cell to rape her while she slept on a nightly basis. I mean, she really begins to lose it. Now, by the mid-1960s, Koch had become convinced, I think with some justification, that German authorities would never permit her release. The Bavarian Minister of Justice, a guy named Hans Ehard, sort of reflects this official line toward Koch in his response to her 1965 petition for clemency. He wrote the following. He says, "Public opinion would not have any understanding that such an exponent of National Socialism's violent rule should be released by an act of clemency." Now, this is at a time when they're releasing, horrid Nazi war criminals through acts of clemency galore. So I think this is quite significant. German judicial authorities here seem to recognize that Koch's sentence was out of proportion to those generally milder sentences handed down by German courts to other convicted Nazi war criminals, which should make her a good candidate for clemency. But at the same time, they explicitly seem to recognize that releasing this, notorious bitch of Buchenwald just simply is not politically viable. And so, in fact, it was after she received her rejection of her final bid for clemency in 1967 that she picked up a pencil in her cell at Eichach prison and wrote a brief note of farewell to her son Uwe. She wrote, quote, "There is no other way. Death for me is a release." And so after a total, if you include her American incarceration, and a total of nearly 24 years in prison, which I should just point out is more time served than nearly any other Nazi perpetrator, save for Hitler's deputy Rudolf Hess.
Yeah, she's right at the top, isn't she, pretty much? Yeah.
Insane. It's insane. She fashioned a noose ultimately from a bed sheet, fastened it to a heating pipe, and essentially brought to an end now the story of the woman that when she died, Newsweek would eulogize as the, quote, best hated woman in the world. So I'd like to just conclude, if I may, by just saying something about how Koch has been remembered since her suicide and how Koch's curious place in popular culture, again, I would say has both informed but also skewed perceptions of Nazi criminality and the Holocaust. In Germany, newspapers presented Koch's suicide kind of as the final act of the archetypical excess, perverse perpetrator, whose alleged sadism and depravity encapsulated what Nazism was all about. So Koch was remembered variously, to quote various German newspapers, as a perverse, power-obsessed, nymphomaniac demon, mouthful, a sadistic monster, and a tormentor and a killer. Now, the fact that Koch had actually died while serving a life sentence for the comparatively lesser crimes of inciting others to violence and murder really just didn't register completely in a country where reckoning with the Nazi past still remained, I think, quite painful and slow. And it just seems to me that Koch provided just a too safe and easy a target for the German public to comfortably condemn without having to reflect on the much more inherent and insidious criminality and in violence that was implicit in, the National Socialism that most people of Koch's era had either supported or, if not, had facilitated in some fashion. So there's also this sense that the demonization of Koch helps to preserve the popular image in Germany also of the allegedly apolitical, good and decent German women who supposedly emerged from the Second World War as kind of morally intact, vessels of national rebirth. Now, back in the United States, Koch's suicide prompted headlines that continued to condemn her for the debunked charge that she had killed inmates for their tattooed skins. So the New York Times remembered her erroneously as having, quote, required prisoners to participate in orgies involving sadism and degeneracy. This is an allegation found absolutely nowhere in the court record or in the reports of war crimes investigators. In a similar fashion, the Washington Post reached but beyond the evidentiary record and into the realm of fiction to remember Koch as having, quote, sexually excited inmates by striding through the camp in tight riding breeches and removing her blouse. Certainly never heard that latter bit of that description. But the effect of all of this, I think, is that in presenting this diabolical and ultimately, I think, ahistorical depiction of Koch, newspaper readers really newspaper readers were provided with an image of concentration camp crimes that required no real reckoning with the fact that rather than sort of monstrous caricatures, most Nazi perpetrators had been ordinary human beings who were nonetheless shown to be capable of perpetrating extraordinary violence and genocide. So the extensive reportage on Koch, I think, therefore distorted popular perceptions of Nazism through focus on crimes which were really unrepresentative of the systematic and bureaucratized mass murder that defined the Third Reich. Now, all this emphasis on the alleged sexual nature of Koch's crimes also fueled a morbid interest in Koch as a figure of eroticism and sexual domination. This is nowhere more evident than in the success of the 1975 pornographic cult film. You can see the remarkable poster here, Ilse She-Wolf of the SS.
And all the sequels. We mustn't forget all the sequels.
Yeah, three lurid sequels. I hope you've seen them all. This film is actually filmed on the abandoned set of Hogan's Heroes, which is kind of remarkable. And it was apparently shot just to make a quick buck. But as Paul has just pointed out, I mean, it really becomes a runaway success in the box office. It pulls in more than $10 million. It screens in 17 countries. And yes, the sequels. So I think as the success of this film shows, the persistence of the popular image of the demonic, the highly sexualized bitch of Buchenwald has to be viewed as the product not only of a desire to condemn a woman depicted as having committed some of history's, most shocking crimes, but also as the result of a popular fascination with the sadistic violence, with the sexual domination that Koch was alleged to have practiced. And of course, the fact that newspaper readers first sort of digested this stuff, reports of her trial, for instance, in a prudish and sexually repressed post-war America, I think really helped to make the sexual dimensions of Koch's violent crimes appear not only more revolting, but for some reason clearly more rousing and more intriguing. So even today, Koch's name remains synonymous with crimes that she was twice cleared of in court. Only recently, I think this is quite remarkable, there's a Discovery Channel documentary series titled The Most Evil Men and Women in History that manages to place Ilse Koch in the company of Genghis Khan, Attila the Hun, Stalin, and Hitler. Now, as a final word, and I will be quiet, let me just emphasize, because I think it's important that we do this, let me emphasize that the wealth of evidence and survivor testimony presented in court against Koch does firmly establish that she was not only morally and ideologically complicit in Nazi crimes, but at times she was an active instigator and perpetrator of violence. So while sympathy, I think, for Koch would be misplaced, her trials do nonetheless reveal how her zealous prosecution, her, by any scale, disproportionately lengthy incarceration, versus other Nazi perpetrators, that this all resulted from social and political pressures and from gendered perceptions of violence and culpability that really served to prevent the dispensation of a truly impartial justice. So to come full circle then, I think we can say that it's only in exploring these pressures and these perceptions that we can understand how a woman who was in reality a pretty inconsequential person in the Reich without any role or rank in the Nazi state was transformed into the personification of its most violent excesses. So,
well, I mean, absolutely spellbinding stuff. And the links to buy the book are in the description below. So all while you were talking, I was thinking of Venn diagrams for some reason. I was thinking of how history overlaps, and when we're talking about people like Joachim Peiper or Kurt Meyer, people don't want to often separate the military prowess that some of these horrible people could display on the battlefield. Yes, he may have been a murderer, but he was very good on the battlefield, and we're not disputing that. But with this case, with Koch's case, there's this, the Venn diagram goes into sexual sadism and bondage and leather, and we mustn't just, it's not just these sort of these soft porn films. The Night Porter with Dirk Bogarde and Charlotte Rampling in 1970 is playing around with this idea of a victim and who's the victim, and sexual masochism, and so. And it's interesting that this is the late 60s, early 70s, because the world is a different place. When people like Kurt Meyer, who we talked about yesterday, released in the late 50s, the Kinsey Report is, half a dozen years old. The world is still prudish. But by the late 60s, it's the 67, it's the summer of love, isn't it? So I don't know that I'm getting too many conclusions with this. I'm exploring the idea that there are these different overlaps with her case that I find intriguing.
I mean, there absolutely are. I mean, I think, there always is this uncomfortable. I mean, with crimes of mass violence to begin with, even if we remove the sexual dimension, there's always the risk of drifting into voyeurism. I think when I teach my students and we have, I'm very careful what images I show, because I really have to ask myself, like in seeing splayed dead bodies on the ground, are they learning something, or are we just sort of being voyeurs into something terrible? And does it just desensitize us to this? And so I think just violence alone, I think we have a tendency as human beings to sort of have this voyeuristic need to look, really. And I think once you add sexual dimensions to it, it's just this, I think it really does for many people become this kind of explosive combination where people are fascinated by it, and they run away with it, and they completely, in Ilse Koch's case, just lose track of who she even was and what this was all about. I mean, I do think it is clear when her main line of defense, basically at her trials, was that she was a good and loyal mother whose place was in her home, and so the defense does a lot of work trying to undermine that idea. Really, what they show to undermine that idea is that indeed she had extramarital affairs, but Carl does too, and I'm sure many of the other people on the dock does too. Nobody's bothering to dig up that, because of course it's men, it's assumed that they do this, but a woman, it's like she's a vile woman who's violating her motherhood to take on these masculine roles. But these really sexual, explicitly sexual things that are attributed to her do seem to be largely apocryphal. There's very little evidence of this. Extramarital affairs and sleeping around, absolutely. But if we remove, gender from this for a second and just say, these are people at Buchenwald and there's soldiers around and people do things, and it's not to condone it or whatever, but, her husband was doing it. He caught syphilis and came back and in fact was treated by an inmate for it. This is what we have on her. And so the sexual dimension is really it's a runaway of the imagination.
Okay, thank you. We had a couple of questions. I think most of them you just addressed as we were going along, but Ian asked, what happened to the children while all these court cases were happening, indeed during her imprisonment?
Well, it's an interesting question. Her oldest children, Artvin and Gisela, were sent to foster care. And I developed a pretty interesting relationship with Gisela as I was writing the book. She died, unfortunately, 2 or 3 years ago. And she was ultimately an incredibly thoughtful and I thought brave woman, because when we began communicating, she had said somebody had approached her, figured out her identity because she changed her name, and she didn't want to talk. And for some reason, she responded to me and she said, I don't know why I'm responding to you. She said it was something to do with the fact that I'm not German. I'm comparatively young. And she wrote me a letter, and we developed this really, I think, interesting correspondence where she was very defensive about her mother, not so about her father, who she very little remembered. She was born, I think, in 1939. Her father was arrested in 1943. So she has very small memories. She could condemn him easily, but her mother, she really defended. And so we developed this relationship where I could tell sometimes when she'd ask me things, she was really disturbed by the answer. One of them, I mentioned just off the cuff how Ilse had joined the party in 1932 before the rise to power. And she said, what? You know, she was totally taken aback by the fact that her mother had been a dedicated Nazi before the rise to power. So we developed this system where I said, look, I'm a historian. I feel a duty to answer your questions honestly and in full. So why don't you think carefully about what questions you want me to answer?
Yeah.
And we'll do it that way. And so we developed this letter writing relationship over the course of about a year and a half, where she'd send me questions. I would answer them. And I thought she was really brave. You could see that as we got further, she asked more and more difficult questions about her mother. And I found her actually in the end very open and very, very thoughtful. But sorry, this is a long-winded way of answering your question. She has very, very difficult memories, because when her parents were arrested, her and her brother were put into foster care, split up, raised for a time with her aunt. That doesn't go well. They wind up in foster care, and she doesn't have a happy story, though she wound up having a nice life in later life. Artwin, her brother, ultimately drank himself to death as a young man and didn't have a great time. The most interesting thing that happens, however, is that the child who she births while on trial, Uwe, is taken away by German authorities immediately. Ilse actually is advised by another inmate who is a lawyer. He says, you know, if you can get to the American hospital and you can give birth there, you can claim that you're under the American flag, and then you can file for a writ of habeas corpus and all this stuff to get out of prison. Of course, it doesn't work at all. Her child is born and is whisked away to foster care. She thinks never to be heard from again. And actually, probably the saddest chapter of the end of her life is that about maybe a year and a half before her suicide, the son, Uwe, figures out who she is and writes to her in prison, comes to visit her, and you can read her letters, and she's totally buoyed by this. And she's, you know, of course, this gives her a huge degree of hope and all this kind of stuff. But then he starts asking her for money, and the relationship gets strained very quickly. And but it is, again, to him that her suicide note is addressed. I asked Gisela, about visiting her in prison and what that looked like, and she made it clear that she was not a frequent visitor. She did visit from time to time, and her mother really was very mentally ill. And I got a lot of the letters from Gisela that she wrote to her, and you know, a lot of pretty awful stuff she wrote in there.
So the last question is really there have been several in the sidebar, really about, as your work during the writing the book and now talking about it, you know, what is your personal take on her? But before I get to ask you that question, it's inevitable that some of the people who were involved in what I call the mid-management level of Nazi atrocities, those people that were in the railways or they were in, you know, the IG Farben kind of guys, if the Nazis hadn't come to power, they probably would never have been involved in these crimes. They'd have just carried on in the processing of paper they were doing. Yeah. But when you get to the people like Koch, who is displaying, regardless of the exaggeration of some of the claims, she obviously isn't completely normal, if whatever that means. So if the Nazis don't happen, if she doesn't meet her husband, do you suspect she's the sort of person that would have had some sort of deviancy in her life anyway? Was she predetermined to be, you know, a sadist? Do you think? I mean, I know it's a very loaded question, hard to answer, but, you know.
Well, I would say first off, and this is not to exonerate Ilse, I think she's an awful woman. She's deeply morally and criminally complicit here. I'm not sure I would say she is a sadist. Right. I'm not sure there's evidence for that. I mean, she did really, the concrete evidence we have, the most convincing evidence we have, is that she did note down the prisoners who she thought weren't working hard enough, and they received beatings. And some others suggested that she did beat a few prisoners with a riding crop. Now, that's awful. But I mean, I think if a guard was at Buchenwald for 5 years and had only those things to his record, I don't think you would say this guy is a deep sadist. So I'm not sure I'd say a sadist. I think she's an unsavory kind of, you know, if the war never came. I mean, you say if the Nazis never came, these mid-level people would never be anything. I mean, I think you can extend that unsettlingly far. Yeah. When you think of all of these, you know, police battalions on the Eastern Front massacring Jews by the thousand, what would have happened to them? I think nothing. I think they would have just continued to be reserve police officers in Germany, and they would have had regular careers. And I think, of course, a lot of the research into perpetrators has really tried to emphasize the importance of context. You can throw normal people into extraordinary scenarios and get those normal people to do extraordinary things.
And the Christopher Browning type studies, exactly. And that it only takes that one leader and a powerful ideology, and everyone suddenly starts following it, and mob mentality becomes a thing. But
totally,
I mean,
so with her, I mean, I think she was a fairly mediocre woman. I think, given the way she treated the staff, and if she did in fact personally inflict some of these beatings, probably with a violent streak, her marriage to Karl is unhappy. She's having affairs. He's having affairs. I mean, she just seems like she is a dedicated Nazi. I mean, she joins the party before the rise to power. She's clearly drawn to it. Her anti-Semitism is never expressed until her late life in her letters, for instance. It's hard to know if that was always there, but she never expressed it, or if it's part of the sort of deluded world that's taking part. But she's an awful woman, But a lot of people done awful things, and a lot of people believed in awful stuff. And I think she certainly deserved to be held to account. But I think what's interesting here is just how far,
and I think that my takeaway of this is it out of context. The fact she served, was it 24 years, doesn't sound too much in some ways, given what she did. But it does sound too much when you consider that other people who are doing arguably more are out after 5 or 6 years. It's not that she's getting more; it's they're not getting enough. Gary said a comment earlier on about as we're going on with this series. He said, read your season, Woody, regarding trials. What seems to be clear is all the defendants were given a fair trial despite their actions, and they are due process is being carried out. We haven't quite tackled the Tokyo trials as much as the Nazi trials. We'll get there.
I'm not sure I would entirely. I think at Dachau, I think you could argue about due process a little bit.
But I mean, it gets. There's a lot of nuance, and there are lots of grey areas there. But the Allies are trying their best.
I think that's
this with the right, because that's hence we did it with Meyer, and we're talking with Tim Cook last night. Hence this need to keep going over things. Are we certain? Are we certain? Almost like how will we be judged now, but how will history regard us? They know they're trying crimes that history are judging, and I guess they also know that history will judge the judging process as well. And how will this be regarded? Would they have thought there'd be people meeting over the internet in 80 years' time discussing these procedures? I don't know. But we will end things there, Thomas, because it's been a fantastic presentation. I've learned a lot, and you've taken us through the disturbing aspects without being too upsetting, but you've also taken us through the intricacies of this very complicated trial. So thank you very much, Thomas. And I say the links to Thomas's book are in the description below. I'll just take your screen for a second, folks. I'm ending this news. Some of you know this already. My best mate, Colin Taylor, passed away this morning. And I'm going to stop right now because I'm going to start crying. So this program, it's an odd one to give in tribute to him, but he would kind of like that in an ironic way because he was a World War II history buff like me. I will see you all again tomorrow. There's 2 shows coming your way. Thank you for being a subscriber or patron, but I'm going to end it now with a tribute to my friend Colin, and I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, viewers. Bye.